Was the Treaty of Karlowitz, signed in the dead of winter in 1699, a peace agreement or a death warrant signed 2 centuries in advance? And what venomous secrets were whispered in the harem of Topkapi Palace that very night when the couriers brought news that the sword of Islam would advance no further into Europe? For the first time in 3 centuries, the mighty Ottoman Empire, the terror of Christendom, the heir to Rome, was not taking land, it was giving it up. A vast swathe of Hungary, once a jewel in the Sultan's crown, was ceded to the Habsburgs. It was a wound, not fatal, but one that would never truly heal. A psychological poison had entered the veins of the state. The age of ceaseless, divinely ordained expansion was over. And when an empire built on conquest stops conquering, what is left for it to do but turn inward and begin to devour itself? The magnificent facade of the Topkapi Palace still gleamed under the Istanbul sun, its courtyards bustling with officials and servants, its gardens fragrant with roses. But behind the gilded screens and silk curtains, a new reality was taking hold. The sultans, once warrior leaders at the head of their armies, were increasingly becoming prisoners. They were prisoners of tradition, of the stifling etiquette of the court, and quite literally of the palace itself. The practice of the cafes, the cage, where potential heirs to the throne were kept in luxurious confinement to prevent rebellion, produced rulers who were paranoid, inexperienced, or outright insane. They knew the whisper of the assassin's blade better than the roar of cannon. Power was no longer projected outward from the Sultan's will. It was a treacherous game played in the shadows by the Grand Vizier, the chief eunuch of the harem, and the Sultan's own mother, the Valide Sultan. The empire's true curse was its own glorious past. Every institution, from the army to the bureaucracy, was a monument to a bygone era, a time when Suleiman the Magnificent could make the kings of Europe tremble. But the world was changing. In the West, new sciences, new technologies, and new forms of political organization were forging nations of unprecedented power. The Ottomans, secure in their sense of cultural and religious superiority, viewed these developments with a mixture of contempt and indifference. Their military doctrine was based on the massive charge of cavalry and the fanatical courage of the Janissaries, a formula that had worked for centuries. But now they faced disciplined European armies with flintlock muskets and bayonets fighting in rigid lines that could break any cavalry charge. Karlowitz was the first lesson. There would be many more, each more brutal than the last. The early 18th century saw a strange and feverish denial of this new reality. The reign of Sultan Ahmed III became known as the Tulip Era. It was an explosion of art, poetry, and extravagant luxury. The court was obsessed with cultivating the perfect tulip, with lavish garden parties that lasted late into the night, illuminated by turtles with candles strapped to their backs. It was beautiful, decadent, and utterly detached from the storm gathering on the frontiers. This was not a renaissance, it was a beautiful fever dream before the patient's final decline. While the elite of Istanbul wrote poetry about flowers, the provinces grew restless. Local lords, the derebes, governed their territories like independent kings, paying little more than lip service to the Sultan. The tax system was a tangled mess of corruption, bleeding the peasants dry while enriching a few powerful families. The empire was not a unified state, but a patchwork quilt of different peoples, religions, and languages, held together by the aging threads of military power and the Sultan's authority as Caliph of all Muslims. When those threads began to snap, the entire fabric threatened to unravel. What is more dangerous, an empire that has forgotten how to fight, or one that has forgotten why it exists? The Tulip Era was an attempt to find a new reason for being, one based on culture and pleasure rather than conquest. But it was a dream built on borrowed time, and the awakening would be rude and violent. The Janissaries, feeling their power and privileges threatened by even the slightest hint of reform, grew mutinous. They saw the court's fascination with French architecture and fashion as a betrayal of sacred tradition. In 1730, a mob led by a former Janissary named Patrona Halil stormed the palace, ending the tulip era in a frenzy of blood and destruction. The Sultan was deposed, his liberal-minded Grand Vizier was murdered, and the tulip gardens were trampled underfoot. It was a chilling message. The past was not ready to die, and it would kill anyone who tried to bury it. The empire was dying not from enemy sabers, but from the quiet poison of its own traditions. What do you think was the greater poison for the Ottoman Empire? The external military defeats that forced it to change, or the internal resistance to any change at all? Let us know in the comments below what you would have battled first, foreign armies or palace intrigues. A new enemy was rising in the north, an empire as vast and ambitious as the Ottoman, but one that was embracing the future with a terrifying ferocity. The Russian Empire, under the visionary and ruthless leadership of Peter the Great and then Catherine the Great, saw the Ottoman state not as a rival, but as an obstacle to be dismantled. Russia's grand ambition was twofold: to control the Black Sea, turning it into a Russian lake, and to resurrect the Byzantine Empire under Russian protection, with its capital in a liberated Constantinople, which they still called Tsargrad. This was Catherine the Great's Greek project, a geopolitical bomb planted at the very heart of Ottoman power in Europe. It was a direct challenge not only to the Sultan's territory, but to his very legitimacy as the protector of Orthodox Christians. The wars that followed were no longer simple border skirmishes, they were existential struggles. The Russo-Turkish Wars of the 18th century were a relentless series of disasters for the Ottomans. Russian armies, led by brilliant generals like Rumyantsev and Suvorov, consistently outmaneuvered and crushed larger Turkish forces. They brought with them a new kind of warfare, methodical and scientific, based on disciplined infantry and overwhelming artillery. The Ottoman response was often brave but chaotic, relying on individual heroism rather than coordinated strategy. The result was a string of humiliating defeats that saw the Crimea, the ancestral land of the Tatars and a key buffer state, fall under Russian control, but the most shocking blow was not delivered on land. In 1770, a Russian naval squadron sailed from the Baltic Sea all the way around Europe and entered the Mediterranean. They cornered the entire Ottoman fleet in the Bay of Chesma, off the coast of Anatolia. Using fire ships, the Russians turned the bay into a floating inferno. Almost the entire Ottoman navy was burned to ashes in a single night. The myth of Ottoman naval supremacy, which had terrified the Mediterranean since the days of Barbarossa, was destroyed in a flash of fire and smoke. The defeat at Chesma sent a shockwave through the empire. It was one thing to lose a battle in the distant Balkans, it was another to have your fleet annihilated in your own backyard. The Black Sea was no longer an Ottoman lake, it was now a highway for Russian warships, which could strike at the very heart of the empire, even threatening Istanbul itself. Can an empire survive when its own seas turn against it? The water that had once carried its conquering armies now carried the ships of its mortal enemy. The Russian storm from the north was not just a military threat, it was an ideological one. Russian agents, posing as merchants and monks, spread throughout the Balkans, secretly encouraging the Orthodox Christian subjects of the Sultan to rise up against their Muslim masters. They distributed weapons, money, and pamphlets promising liberation under the protection of the Third Rome, Moscow. This ignited a fire that had been smoldering for centuries. The first great explosion was the Greek War of Independence, which erupted in 1821. This was not a war between empires, it was a new, far more savage kind of conflict. It was a war of nation against nation, of neighbor against neighbor. The rebellion was characterized by incredible brutality on both sides. Greek rebels massacred Turkish civilians, and Ottoman forces responded with horrific reprisals, like the infamous massacre on the island of Chios, which shocked and outraged Europe. The war became a romantic cause for intellectuals and adventurers across the continent. Men like the English poet Lord Byron flocked to Greece to fight for its freedom, seeing it as a new crusade to liberate the cradle of Western civilization from Oriental despotism. Their involvement helped to sway European public opinion and eventually forced the great powers, Britain, France, and Russia, to intervene. In 1827, a combined European fleet confronted and destroyed the Ottoman Egyptian navy at the Battle of Navarino, sealing the fate of the conflict. Greece would be independent. The victory was a triumph for European power and for the new idea of nationalism. For the Ottoman Empire, it was a catastrophe. It proved that the empire could be dismembered not just by external invasion, but by internal rebellion supported from abroad. A precedent had been set. If the Greeks could do it, why not the Serbs, the Bulgarians, the Romanians, the Albanians? The Balkan provinces, once a source of strength and manpower, were now a ticking time bomb, a powder keg, waiting for a spark. The empire was fighting a war on two fronts, against the modern armies of Russia and against the modern idea of nationalism that was tearing it apart from within. The old ways of governing, of balancing the interests of different religious communities under the Sultan's authority, were no longer working. The world had changed, but the empire had not. It was a giant from another age, bewildered and enraged by the challenges of a new world it could not comprehend. Its response to these challenges was often clumsy and brutal, which only fueled the hatred of its enemies and the despair of its subjects. Every attempt to reassert control only seemed to hasten the process of disintegration. The fire of Greek independence was just the beginning. The entire Balkan peninsula was smoldering, and the winds from Russia were fanning the flames. The empire was facing a century of insurrection and war, a long, bloody ordeal that would bleed it dry and leave it vulnerable to even greater predators. The problem was clear. To survive, the empire had to modernize its army, its government, its very way of thinking, but the most powerful force inside the empire was dedicated to preventing precisely that. They were a law unto themselves, a brotherhood of warriors who had become the state's jailers. They were the Janissaries. The Janissaries, the very name once inspired fear and awe. They were the Sultan's elite, the first modern standing army in Europe. Recruited as boys from Christian families in the Balkans through the Devshirme system, they were converted to Islam and forged into a fanatically loyal and disciplined fighting force. They were slaves of the Sultan, yet they were the masters of the battlefield. For centuries, their disciplined volleys and terrifying charges had shattered the armies of Crusaders, Hungarians, and Persians. They were the steel spine of the empire. But by the early 19th century, the spine had turned cancerous. The Janissaries had become a state within a state, a deeply conservative and corrupt institution that jealously guarded its privileges. They were no longer elite soldiers. They were a privileged social class of shopkeepers and artisans in Istanbul who happened to be on the military payroll. They rarely drilled, their weapons were outdated, and they refused to adopt modern European tactics. Yet their power was absolute. They were kingmakers and kingbreakers. If a sultan attempted any reform that threatened their status or their pensions, they would simply overturn their giant soup cauldrons in the barrack square, the traditional signal for revolt. More than one sultan had been deposed and murdered by the very men sworn to protect him. They were the greatest obstacle to progress, the living embodiment of the glorious past that was strangling the empire's future. What do you do when the cure for your sickness is guarded by a dragon that will burn you alive if you try to reach for it? For Sultan Mahmud II, the answer was simple. You must first slay the dragon. Mahmud was a different kind of sultan. He had survived the deadly intrigues of the palace, spending years as a virtual prisoner, watching his reform-minded predecessor, Selim III, be murdered by the Janissaries. He had learned patience, cunning, and absolute ruthlessness. He knew that any open attempt to create a new army would be met with immediate rebellion. So he prepared his ground in secret. For years, he quietly placed loyal men in key positions. He built up the artillery corps, the only part of the military that was technically advanced and deeply hostile to the Janissaries. He cultivated the support of the religious scholars, the ulama, securing a religious opinion, a fatwa, that declared opposition to the Sultan's military reforms to be a sin. He was preparing not just a reform, but an extermination. The moment came in June of 1826. Mahmud announced the creation of a new infantry corps, the Eşkinci, to be trained along European lines. As expected, the Janissaries rose in revolt. They overturned their cauldrons and marched on the palace, demanding the Sultan's head. But this time, Mahmud was ready. He unfurled the sacred banner of the Prophet Muhammad, calling on all loyal Muslims to rally to their caliph against the rebels. The people of Istanbul, long tired of the Janissaries' arrogance and bullying, answered the call, but the deciding factor was not the mob, it was the artillery. The Sultan's cannons, manned by well-trained gunners, were rolled into position overlooking the hippodrome where the Janissaries had gathered. What followed was not a battle, it was a massacre. The artillery opened fire at point-blank range, tearing through the crowded ranks of the rebels with grape-shot and cannonballs. The Janissaries, armed mostly with muskets and swords, had no answer to modern artillery. They broke and fled back to their barracks, but there was no escape. The barracks were surrounded and bombarded relentlessly until the wooden structures caught fire, turning into a funeral pyre for thousands. For days, the streets of Istanbul ran with blood as the Sultan's forces hunted down and executed every Janissary they could find. The slaughter was officially named the Vaka-i Hayriye, the auspicious incident. It was a brutal, bloody affair that wiped out a centuries-old institution in a matter of hours. With the Janissaries gone, the path to reform was finally open. Mahmud could now build a new army, a new bureaucracy, and a new state from the ground up. He had performed a life-saving surgery on the body of the empire, cutting out a malignant tumor. But the surgery itself was horrific, and it came at a terrible cost. He had destroyed the old military core of the empire, and his new army would take years to train and become effective. In the short term, the empire was weaker and more vulnerable than ever. Did he save the empire by destroying its soul? Or did he simply trade a slow death from disease for the risk of a quick death from a predator's attack? The answer would come sooner than he thought. For in his own province of Egypt, his most powerful and ambitious governor had been watching. This man had already built the modern army that Mahmud dreamed of. He had learned Europe's lessons of power and efficiency all too well. His name was Muhammad Ali, and having watched his master solve one problem by creating a vacuum of power, he saw an opportunity not just to defy the Sultan, but to replace him. The greatest threat was no longer an ancient institution, it was a modern ambition forged in the same fire of reform that the Sultan himself was trying to ignite. The betrayal came not from a foreign capital like St. Petersburg or Vienna, but from Cairo, the heart of one of the empire's richest provinces. Muhammad Ali was an Albanian officer who had been sent to Egypt to fight the French under Napoleon Bonaparte. In the chaos that followed, he had cleverly schemed and fought his way to the top, becoming the Ottoman governor. But he was a governor in name only. In reality, he was the absolute ruler of Egypt, and he had ambitions that stretched far beyond the Nile. He was a modernizer, but not out of any enlightened philosophy. He was a realist who understood that power in the new century grew from the barrel of a European-style rifle and the efficiency of a centralized state. While the sultans in Istanbul were struggling with the Janissaries, Muhammad Ali was building a modern, conscripted army trained by French officers. He established factories to produce weapons, built a modern navy, and reformed the administration and tax system of Egypt to fund his military machine. His army was, without question, the most powerful and effective fighting force in the entire Middle East, far superior to the Sultan's own fledgling forces. He was a vassal who had become stronger than his lord. The first test of this new power came during the Greek War of Independence. Sultan Mahmud, unable to crush the rebellion himself, had reluctantly asked for Muhammad Ali's help. The Egyptian army, led by Muhammad Ali's brilliant son, Ibrahim Pasha, had landed in Greece and quickly demonstrated its superiority, crushing the Greek rebels with ruthless efficiency. They were on the verge of victory when the European powers intervened at Navarino, destroying the combined Ottoman-Egyptian fleet. For Muhammad Ali, this was a bitter pill. He had sacrificed his men and his ships for his sultan, only to be thwarted by the Europeans. He demanded compensation, asking for control of Syria as a reward for his services. When the Sultan refused, Muhammad Ali decided to take it by force. In 1831, Ibrahim Pasha led the Egyptian army into Syria. It was a lightning campaign, a 19th-century blitzkrieg. The Ottoman garrisons, poorly led and demoralized, were swept aside. The Egyptians conquered all of Syria and Palestine in a matter of months. Then they marched north into Anatolia itself, the Turkish heartland. Sultan Mahmud sent army after army against them, but each was outmaneuvered and decisively defeated by Ibrahim's superior forces. At the Battle of Konya, deep inside Anatolia, the last major Ottoman army was shattered, and the Grand Vizier himself was taken prisoner. The road to Istanbul was wide open. A wave of panic swept through the capital. The empire that had once besieged Vienna was now unable to defend its own capital from one of its own governors. The irony was bitter. The Sultan's most dangerous enemy was not a Russian Tsar or an Austrian emperor, but his own servant, using the very tools of modernization that Mahmud himself was trying to implement. It was a terrifying lesson. Reform was a double-edged sword. It could strengthen the center, but it could also create provincial power bases strong enough to challenge the center itself. Desperate, with his own rebel army practically at the gates of his palace, Sultan Mahmud did the unthinkable. He asked his oldest and most hated enemy for help. He appealed to Russia. The Tsar, Nicholas I, was more than happy to oblige. He saw a golden opportunity to turn the Ottoman Empire into a Russian protectorate. A Russian fleet sailed into the Bosphorus, and Russian troops landed on the shores of the strait, ostensibly to defend Istanbul from Ibrahim Pasha. The sight of Russian soldiers camping within view of the Topkapi Palace was a profound humiliation, a nightmare made real. Britain and France, alarmed at the prospect of Russia gaining complete control over the Ottoman Empire, immediately intervened. They pressured Muhammad Ali to halt his advance, forcing him to negotiate. The result was a settlement that gave Muhammad Ali control over Syria and other territories, but forced him to withdraw from Anatolia. The Sultan was saved, but his sovereignty was in tatters. He had only been able to defeat one rebel by inviting a far more dangerous predator into his own house. The crisis revealed the empire's utter weakness. It could no longer manage its own internal affairs. Its fate was now in the hands of the great powers of Europe, who treated it like a chessboard on which they played their great game of imperial rivalry. They saved the Ottoman Empire not out of any kindness, but because its sudden collapse would create a power vacuum that could lead to a general European war. They preferred a weak, pliable empire that they could manipulate and exploit to a chaotic free-for-all. This intervention began a new phase in the empire's decline. Henceforth, its survival would depend on the cynical calculations of European diplomats. Every crisis, every rebellion would be accompanied by a flurry of diplomatic notes and the menacing movement of foreign fleets. The empire was now a patient, and the European powers were the doctors, all gathered around the bedside, arguing over the course of treatment while secretly hoping to inherit the patient's possessions. The age of grand strategy was over. The age of desperate survival had begun. The great powers claimed they were preserving the empire, but was their protection a form of life support, or a slow-acting poison that paralyzed the patient while they picked his pockets? Tell us what you think was the more humiliating fate for the Sultan, being overthrown by his own ambitious servant, or being saved by his ancient enemy. The empire was now officially the sick man of Europe, a label famously applied by Tsar Nicholas I. It was a diagnosis that was both accurate and deeply cynical, as the doctors gathered around the bed were often the ones spreading the disease. The mid-19th century saw a new wave of reforms known as the Tanzimat, or reorganization. Spurred by the humiliation of the war with Muhammad Ali, a new generation of Western-educated Ottoman bureaucrats sought to modernize the state from top to bottom. They issued decrees promising equality for all subjects, regardless of religion, a radical departure from traditional Islamic law. They aimed to create a new concept of common citizenship, Ottomanism, hoping it would bind the empire's diverse peoples together. They reformed the legal system, the administration, and the military, modeling them on French and British examples. On paper, it was a revolution. In practice, it was a desperate struggle against centuries of tradition and deep-seated resistance. Many Muslims saw the reforms as a betrayal of their faith, an unholy imitation of the infidel West. Many Christians, on the other hand, saw them as too little, too late, and continued to look to Russia or other European powers for protection and eventual liberation. The reforms also required vast sums of money, which the empire did not have. To finance its new army, navy, and bureaucracy, the Ottoman government began to take out massive loans from European banks. This was the beginning of a fatal debt trap. The empire was mortgaging its future to pay for its present, becoming financially dependent on the very powers that were carving up its territory. This fragile, indebted, and internally divided state was soon dragged into a conflict that was not of its own making, the Crimean War. The war began over a seemingly trivial dispute between Catholic and Orthodox monks over who should hold the keys to the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem. But this was merely a pretext for a much larger geopolitical struggle. Russia sought to expand its influence, while Britain and France were determined to stop it. The Ottoman Empire was the battlefield. The war, fought from 1853 to 1856, was a brutal and often ineptly managed affair, famous for the bungled charge of the Light Brigade and the horrific conditions in the military hospitals which prompted the pioneering nursing work of Florence Nightingale. Ottoman soldiers fought bravely alongside their British and French allies, particularly in the heroic defense of the fortress of Silistra and the siege of Sevastopol in the Crimea. In the end, the Allies were victorious. Russia was defeated and its advance was temporarily halted. From the perspective of Istanbul, the war was a success. The empire had, for once, been on the winning side of a major European conflict. Its territorial integrity was guaranteed by the great powers at the Congress of Paris. But it was a Pyrrhic victory. The war had cost the empire dearly in blood and treasure. It had pushed the state to the brink of bankruptcy, forcing it to take on even more crippling foreign loans. The treaty that guaranteed its integrity also formalized the great powers' right to interfere in its internal affairs, particularly concerning the treatment of its Christian subjects. The empire had survived, but it had lost its independence. It was now a junior partner in the European state system, a protectorate in all but name. The soldiers who died in the mud of the Crimea had not secured the empire's future. They had merely purchased a few more decades of borrowed time. The Tanzimat reforms continued after the war, but they could not solve the fundamental problem. The idea of Ottomanism failed to take root. The Balkan Christians, emboldened by Russia's continued support, grew more restless. The empire's Muslim population grew more resentful of the new laws that gave Christians equal rights. The attempt to create a modern, secular state was tearing the traditional multi-religious empire apart. The money from European loans flowed into building new palaces, ministries, and an ironclad navy, but much of it was also wasted on corruption and inefficiency. By the 1870s, the government was effectively bankrupt and had to default on its loan payments. This led to the establishment of the Ottoman Public Debt Administration, an organization controlled by European creditors that took over vast sections of the empire's economy, collecting taxes and revenues directly to pay back the foreign bondholders. It was the ultimate humiliation. The empire had lost control of its own treasury. The sick man was now in receivership. His pockets were being turned out by his creditors, even as his limbs were beginning to be torn away by nationalist revolts. The victory in the Crimea had solved nothing. It had only set the stage for the next, far more catastrophic confrontation in the Balkans. The powder keg was primed, and the fuse was about to be lit. The explosion came in 1875. It started with an uprising of peasants in Bosnia and Herzegovina protesting against oppressive taxes. Soon, the fire of rebellion spread to Bulgaria. In 1876, a poorly organized but fiercely determined uprising, known as the April Uprising, broke out. The Ottoman response was swift and brutal. The regular army was tied down elsewhere, so the government armed irregular troops, the Bazouks. These undisciplined mercenaries swept through the Bulgarian countryside, perpetrating horrific massacres. Entire villages were burned, and thousands of unarmed men, women, and children were slaughtered. News of the Bulgarian horrors reached Europe, amplified by sensationalist newspaper reports and the passionate denunciations of public figures like the British statesman William Gladstone. A wave of anti-Turkish outrage swept across the continent. This was the moment Russia had been waiting for. Portraying itself as the protector of the oppressed Slavic and Orthodox peoples, Russia declared war in 1877. The Russo-Turkish War of 1877 to 1878 was a disaster for the Ottomans. The new army, created after the destruction of the Janissaries, was still no match for the Russian war machine. The Russians swept through the Balkans, their advance only temporarily halted by the heroic but ultimately futile defense of the fortress of Plevna by the Ottoman general Osman Pasha. After a grueling 5-month siege, Plevna fell, and the road to Istanbul was once again open. The Russian army advanced to the very outskirts of the capital, forcing the Sultan to sue for peace. The resulting Treaty of San Stefano was a victor's peace, a complete dismemberment of the Ottoman Empire in Europe. A huge independent Bulgaria was created, stretching from the Danube to the Aegean Sea, effectively a Russian satellite state. Serbia, Montenegro, and Romania were also granted full independence. The Ottoman Empire had been virtually expelled from Europe. This overwhelming Russian victory, however, alarmed the other great powers, particularly Britain and Austria-Hungary. They feared that the new Big Bulgaria would give Russia effective control of the Balkans and the strategic straits leading to the Mediterranean. A new European war seemed imminent. To avert this, the German Chancellor, Otto von Bismarck, convened the Congress of Berlin in 1878. He cast himself in the role of the honest broker, but the reality was a cynical exercise in power politics. The great powers proceeded to carve up the Ottoman territories to suit their own interests. The big Bulgaria of San Stefano was broken up. A smaller Bulgarian principality was created, while other territories were returned to Ottoman rule, or handed over to Austria-Hungary, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and Britain, Cyprus. Everyone took a piece of the pie. The Sultan's representatives could only watch in impotent silence as their empire was dissected on the conference table. The Congress of Berlin was a landmark event. It confirmed the independence of the Balkan nations and effectively marked the end of Ottoman power in Europe. But it did not bring peace. Instead, by drawing arbitrary borders and trading populations, it created a host of new grievances and rivalries among the newly independent states. It solved one set of problems by creating a dozen more, planting the seeds for future conflicts, including the Balkan Wars and even the First World War. For the Ottoman Empire, the consequences were devastating. It had lost the majority of its European provinces, vast amounts of territory, population, and resources. A flood of Muslim refugees, the Muhajirs, poured into the remaining Ottoman lands, fleeing persecution in the newly independent Christian states. Their stories of suffering and dispossession fueled a growing sense of anger and resentment against both the Christian powers of Europe and the empire's own remaining Christian subjects. The dream of a harmonious multi-ethnic Ottomanism died in the blood and fire of the Balkan Wars. It was replaced by a darker, more defensive and more aggressive Turkish and Islamic identity. The era of liberal reform was over. In its place would rise a new era of absolutism, paranoia, and state-sponsored violence, all under the rule of a sultan who had learned a harsh lesson. In a world of wolves, you cannot afford to be a sheep. His name was Abdul Hamid II. His reign began in chaos. He came to the throne in 1876, a year of crisis, with rebellion in the Balkans, an empty treasury, and the great powers circling like vultures. In a brief nod to the reformist spirit of the age, he promulgated the empire's first constitution and opened its first parliament. But this was a fleeting experiment. Using the disastrous war with Russia as a pretext, He dissolved the parliament in 1878 and suspended the constitution. For the next 30 years, he would rule as an absolute monarch, one of the last great autocrats of the 19th century. Abdülhamid II is one of the most controversial figures in Ottoman history. To his enemies, he was the Red Sultan, or Abdul the Damned, a bloody tyrant responsible for the massacre of tens of thousands of his Armenian subjects. To his supporters, he was a shrewd and pious ruler who held the crumbling empire together for 3 decades through clever diplomacy and firm control, a true caliph protecting the Muslim world from the rapacious greed of the West. Both portraits contain a measure of truth. He was a man driven by a deep sense of paranoia, and with good reason. He had seen his predecessors deposed and murdered. He had watched as foreign powers and internal rebellions tore his empire apart. His primary goal was survival, his own and that of his dynasty and state. He ruled from the secluded Yildiz Palace, a fortified complex from which he rarely emerged. He trusted no one. He built up a vast network of spies and secret police that permeated every level of society. Censorship was pervasive. Words like Armenia, freedom, and revolution were banned from print. He played the great powers off against each other with considerable skill, using their mutual jealousies to preserve what remained of his empire. He also emphasized his role as caliph, the spiritual leader of all Sunni Muslims, promoting a pan-Islamic ideology to counter the divisive poison of nationalism and to rally support from Muslims as far away as India and Africa against European colonialism. But his paranoia and his determination to maintain absolute control had a dark side. The empire's large Armenian Christian minority became a particular object of his suspicion. Living in the eastern provinces bordering Russia, they were seen as a potential fifth column, a community that might seek independence with Russian help, just as the Balkan Christians had. When Armenian nationalist groups began to agitate for reforms and autonomy, the state's response was savage. Between 1894 and 1896, a series of widespread massacres, known as the Hamidian massacres, were unleashed against the Armenian population. Ottoman troops and Kurdish irregulars killed tens of thousands of Armenian civilians. It was a brutal message to any group that dared to challenge the authority of the state. While the Red Sultan was locking down the empire in a prison of fear and suspicion, a new opposition was forming, not in the villages of Anatolia, but in the cafes of Paris and the military academies of Salonika. They were the Young Turks, a diverse group of exiles, army officers, and intellectuals who were united by their hatred of Abdülhamid's despotic rule and their fervent belief that the only way to save the empire was through a return to the constitution and a program of radical modernization. Their official name was the Committee of Union and Progress, CUP. They were a secret society organized in clandestine cells, particularly among the officer corps of the Ottoman Third Army stationed in Macedonia. These young, Western-educated officers saw the empire's weakness and humiliation on a daily basis as they struggled to deal with the endless cycle of insurgency and foreign intervention in the Balkans. They believed that Abdülhamid's tyranny was the root cause of the problem. They dreamed of a revitalized empire where all citizens, Turks, Arabs, Armenians, Greeks, Jews, would be united as equal Ottomans, their loyalty pledged to a constitutional state, not a paranoid sultan. In July of 1908, the Young Turks made their move. Led by officers like Enver Bey, the CUP instigated a military revolt in Macedonia. The rebellion spread like wildfire. When Abdülhamid realized that his own armies would not defend him, he was forced to capitulate. He announced the restoration of the Constitution of 1876. The news was greeted with scenes of incredible jubilation across the empire. In cities from the Balkans to Syria, people poured into the streets. For a brief, intoxicating moment, the old ethnic and religious hatreds seemed to be forgotten. Turks and Armenians, Greeks and Jews, Muslims and Christians embraced in public, celebrating their newfound freedom and brotherhood. It seemed like the dawn of a new era. But it was a false dawn. Tyranny is a disease that often mutates rather than disappears. The revolution had been easy. Building a new nation would prove to be impossible. What would you trust more to save a failing state? The iron fist of a ruthless dictator who maintains order, or the chaotic promise of a young revolution that could lead to freedom or anarchy? Let us know in the comments if you would bet on order or freedom. The euphoria of the Young Turk Revolution of 1908 quickly faded, giving way to the harsh realities of governing a collapsing empire. The Committee of Union and Progress, which had operated so effectively as a secret revolutionary society, found itself ill-equipped for the messy business of politics. The brief moment of interethnic brotherhood shattered as different nationalist groups, Arabs, Albanians, and others, began to demand more autonomy, not less. The CUP itself was fractured, split between a liberal wing that favored a decentralized democratic state and a more radical nationalist wing that believed in a centralized Turkish-dominated government. Power, it turned out, was much harder to wield than to seize. While the new government struggled with internal divisions, the empire's external enemies saw an opportunity in the chaos. In 1911, Italy, a latecomer to the game of colonial expansion, declared war and invaded the Ottoman provinces of Tripolitania and Cyrenaica, modern-day Libya. The Italo-Turkish War was a showcase for new military technologies. It saw the first use of airplanes for reconnaissance and bombing in history. The Ottomans, with their navy unable to challenge the Italian fleet, could send only a handful of officers, including a young and ambitious major named Mustafa Kemal, to organize local Arab resistance. Despite a valiant guerrilla campaign, the outcome was never in doubt. The empire was forced to cede Libya to Italy, its last territory in North Africa. The loss of Libya was a humiliation, but it was merely the prelude to a far greater catastrophe. Seeing the empire's weakness, the small Balkan states that had once been its subjects decided to complete the work they had begun 30 years earlier. In 1912, a coalition of Bulgaria, Serbia, Greece, and Montenegro, known as the Balkan League, declared war on the Ottoman Empire. The First Balkan War was a military nightmare for the Ottomans. Their armies, disorganized by the political turmoil following the revolution and led by incompetent politically appointed commanders, were utterly routed. In a matter of weeks, the Balkan allies had overrun almost all of the empire's remaining European territories. The Bulgarian army advanced to the Shatalya lines, the last line of defense just outside Istanbul. The Greeks took the strategic port city of Salonika. The Serbs conquered Macedonia and Albania. It was one of the most swift and decisive military collapses of the modern era. The shock and panic in Istanbul were immense. The city was flooded with hundreds of thousands of terrified Muslim refugees fleeing the advancing Balkan armies, bringing with them horrific stories of massacre and ethnic cleansing. The shame of the defeat led to a political crisis. In January of 1913, a group of radical Kopi officers led by the charismatic and reckless Enver Bey stormed the Sublime Porte, the central government building. In a dramatic coup d'etat, they shot the Minister of War and forced the Grand Vizier to resign at gunpoint. This event brought the most extreme nationalist faction of the Young Turks to power. From that point on, the empire would be ruled not by the Sultan or a parliament, but by a military dictatorship, a triumvirate of three powerful men: Enver Pasha, the Minister of War, Talat Pasha, the Minister of the Interior, and Jamal Pasha, the Minister of the Marine. These three pashas were determined to save the empire, to reverse its humiliation, and to forge a new, strong, and unapologetically Turkish state. They were men of action, impatient with debate and contemptuous of compromise. They believed that the empire's salvation lay not in liberal ideas of brotherhood, but in military strength, centralized control, and a fierce, exclusive Turkish nationalism. They were willing to gamble everything on one last, desperate throw of the dice to restore the empire's lost glory. The opportunity for that gamble was fast approaching. In the summer of 1914, an archduke was assassinated in the Balkan city of Sarajevo, a city that had been under Ottoman rule just a few decades earlier. A local crisis was about to engulf the entire continent in a war of unprecedented scale and savagery. The Great War was coming, and the three pashas, seeing a chance to win a powerful ally and reclaim lost territories, would lead their exhausted and broken empire straight into the abyss. The decision to enter the First World War was not a foregone conclusion. The Ottoman government was deeply divided. Most ministers favored neutrality, arguing that the empire was too weak and impoverished after the Balkan Wars to survive another major conflict. But Enver Pasha, the ambitious Minister of War, thought differently. He was a fervent Germanophile, deeply impressed by German military power and convinced that an alliance with the Central Powers, Germany and Austria-Hungary, was the empire's only path to salvation. A victory alongside Germany, he believed, would allow the empire to throw off the shackles of foreign debt, reclaim territories lost to Russia, and even realize his pan-Turkic dream of uniting the Turkic peoples of Central Asia under the Ottoman flag. He pursued a secret alliance with Germany, largely behind the backs of his own government colleagues. The decisive moment came in August of 1914. Two German warships, the battlecruiser Goeben and the light cruiser Breslau, were trapped in the Mediterranean by a superior British fleet. In a daring move, they raced to the Dardanelles and requested passage to Istanbul. In a flagrant violation of international law regarding neutral nations, the Ottoman government, under pressure from Enver, allowed them to enter. To circumvent the treaties, the ships were fictitiously sold to the Ottoman navy. They raised the Ottoman flag, their German crews donned Turkish fezzes, but the German admiral Wilhelm Souchon remained in command. This act effectively sealed the empire's fate. In late October, Admiral Souchon, acting on secret orders from Enver Pasha, led his new Ottoman fleet into the Black Sea and bombarded the Russian ports of Sevastopol and Odessa. Russia responded by declaring war. Britain and France soon followed. The Ottoman Empire was now in the Great War. The war was a multi-front struggle fought on a vast scale. The Ottomans faced the Russians in the rugged mountains of the Caucasus, the British in Mesopotamia and Egypt, and a combined Allied force in the Gallipoli Peninsula. The first major campaign was a disaster. Enver Pasha, seeking a glorious victory, personally took command of the Third Army and launched a winter offensive against the Russians in the Caucasus. The Battle of Sarikamish in December of 1914 was a catastrophe of epic proportions. Poorly equipped for the brutal winter conditions, an entire Ottoman army of nearly 90,000 men was wiped out, with most freezing to death in the mountains without ever seeing the enemy. It was a staggering blow, but the empire's soldiers were capable of incredible resilience. In 1915, they achieved their greatest and most iconic victory of the war, when a massive Allied fleet, followed by a large-scale land invasion of British, Australian, New Zealand, and French troops, tried to force its way through the Dardanelles Strait to capture Istanbul, they were met with ferocious and determined Ottoman resistance. The Gallipoli campaign turned into a bloody 9-month stalemate. Under the brilliant command of Mustafa Kemal, the same officer who had fought in Libya, the Ottoman Fifth Army clung to the high ground, repelling every Allied attack. The trenches of Gallipoli were a hell of heat, flies, disease, and constant death, but the Ottoman soldiers held their ground. In the end, the Allies were forced to admit defeat and evacuate, having suffered 250,000 casualties. Gallipoli was a stunning defensive victory, a source of immense pride that helped to forge the national identity of modern Turkey. But it was a victory that came at a terrible price, and it could not change the grim reality on other fronts. As the war raged on, the young Turk government, in the grip of a paranoid and radical Turkish nationalism, turned on one of its own minorities. The Armenian population, mostly Christians living in the eastern provinces near the Russian front, was viewed by the Kup regime as a dangerously subversive element, a potential ally of the enemy. In 1915, using the pretext of military necessity and isolated incidents of Armenian resistance, the government embarked on a systematic policy of deportation and massacre. The Armenian genocide was one of the darkest chapters of the war. Hundreds of thousands of Armenian men were summarily executed. Women, children, and the elderly were forced on death marches into the Syrian desert with little food or water. They were subjected to starvation, disease, and brutal attacks by guards and bandits. By the end of the war, more than 1 million Armenians were dead, and a 2,000-year-old civilization had been effectively eradicated from its Anatolian homeland. The empire, in its own death throes, was committing a monstrous crime against its own people. While the genocide unfolded, other parts of the empire were breaking away. In 1916, Sharif Hussein of Mecca, instigated and supplied by the British officer T.E. Lawrence, Lawrence of Arabia, launched the Arab revolt against Ottoman rule. Arab forces, fighting a guerrilla war, blew up railways and tied down thousands of Ottoman troops, helping the British advance from Egypt into Palestine and Syria. The promise of a unified Arab kingdom made by the British was a powerful incentive. By 1918, the empire was collapsing on all fronts. British forces had captured Baghdad and Jerusalem. The Balkan front was gone. The Ottoman armies, bled white by 4 years of brutal warfare, starvation, and disease, were at the end of their tether. In October of 1918, with its German ally on the verge of collapse, the Ottoman government signed the Armistice of Mudros, ending its participation in the First World War. The three pashas fled the country into exile, leaving others to deal with the consequences of their fatal gamble. The war was over. The Ottoman Empire had been utterly and irrevocably shattered. The end came not with a bang, but with a quiet, soul-crushing humiliation. The Armistice of Mudros was a capitulation. It allowed the victorious Allied powers to occupy any part of the empire they deemed necessary for their security. Soon, British, French, and Italian warships anchored in the Bosphorus, their guns trained on the Sultans' palaces. Istanbul, the proud capital of empires for 16 centuries, was an occupied city. The last Ottoman Sultan, Mehmed VI, was a prisoner in his own palace, a powerless puppet whose authority did not extend beyond the city limits. The rest of the empire was being carved up. French troops occupied Syria and Cilicia. The British controlled Mesopotamia, Palestine, and the Straits. The Italians landed in the southwest. The empire, which had existed for over 600 years, had ceased to exist as a sovereign state. The final killing blow came in 1920 with the Treaty of Sèvres. It was a punitive peace treaty designed to dismantle the Ottoman state completely. It gave vast territories in eastern Anatolia to a newly independent Armenia and provided for an autonomous Kurdistan. It gave the strategic port city of Smyrna and its hinterland to Greece. The Straits were to be internationalized. The empire's finances were to be placed under total Allied control. What was left of the Sultan's domain was a small, landlocked rump state in central Anatolia, existing only at the mercy of the great powers. It was a treaty so harsh, so humiliating, that no self-respecting Turk could accept it. It was a death sentence, and it provoked not submission, but a furious, desperate resistance. At this darkest hour, when all seemed lost, a new leader emerged from the heart of Anatolia. He was the hero of Gallipoli, the one commander who had emerged from the disastrous war with his reputation enhanced, General Mustafa Kemal. Defying both the Allied occupiers and the collaborationist government of the Sultan in Istanbul, he traveled to central Anatolia to organize a nationalist resistance movement. He declared the Sultan's government illegitimate and established a rival government in the city of Ankara. This was the beginning of the Turkish War of Independence. It was a war fought against incredible odds. The Turkish nationalists were a ragged army of veterans, peasants, and militia, poorly armed and surrounded by enemies. Their primary foe was the Greek army, which, with Allied encouragement, had landed at Smyrna and was advancing deep into Anatolia, seeking to realize the Megali idea, the great idea of a resurrected Greek empire encompassing all the lands of ancient Hellenism. The war was brutal, a final bloody spasm of the centuries-long conflict between Greek and Turk. For 2 years, the tide of battle ebbed and flowed, but under Mustafa Kemal's brilliant and ruthless leadership, the Turkish nationalist forces were forged into a disciplined and effective army. In August of 1922, they launched a massive counter-offensive known as the Great Offensive. The Greek front collapsed and their army was routed. The Turkish forces drove the Greeks back to the sea, culminating in the recapture of Smyrna. The city, a cosmopolitan hub of Greeks, Armenians, and Levantines, was engulfed in a catastrophic fire that destroyed the Greek and Armenian quarters and ended 3,000 years of Hellenic presence on the Anatolian coast. The victory over the Greeks was total. The Turkish nationalists had done what had seemed impossible. They had defeated an Allied-backed army and torn up the Treaty of Sèvres. Faced with a new, defiant, and militarily successful Turkish state, the Allies were forced back to the negotiating table. The result was the Treaty of Lausanne in 1923, which recognized the full sovereignty and the current borders of Turkey. But Mustafa Kemal's revolution was not just about saving the state, it was about creating a new one. In November of 1922, his Grand National Assembly in Ankara voted to abolish the Ottoman Sultanate, ending 631 years of imperial rule. The last Sultan, Mehmed VI, slipped out of his palace and was carried into exile on a British battleship. A year later, the Turkish Republic was officially proclaimed, with Mustafa Kemal as its first president. In 1924, he took the final step, abolishing the caliphate, severing the last link to the empire's Islamic and multinational past. The empire was dead. From its ashes, a new, secular, and fiercely national Turkish state had been born. The fall of the Ottoman Empire was not a single event, but a long, agonizing process that spanned 2 centuries. It was a story of military defeat and diplomatic humiliation, but also of internal decay, of the clash between tradition and modernity, between a multi-ethnic empire and the irresistible force of nationalism. The colossus that had once terrified Europe died a slow, painful death, and in its final moments, it gave birth to a new world of nation-states in the Middle East and the Balkans, a world whose conflicts and tensions continue to shape our own. The story of the empire's fall is a timeless lesson in the fragility of power and the brutal, unforgiving price that history demands for the right to a future. The empire is gone, but its legacy remains, written in the borders and conflicts of the modern world. Looking back at its final, violent chapter, who do you see as the true founder of modern Turkey? The last sultan who tried to preserve his dynasty through diplomacy, or the rebel general who saved the nation by destroying the empire? Share your verdict in the comments.